Hello and welcome to my channel, I Win to Lose Gaming. It's time for an ultimate Flins guide video where you'll learn everything you need to know to flinflate Flins' damage. This guide is flinsanely long, so let's just cut right to the chase. Flins is our first Lunar-Charged DPS character with some flinteristing mechanics that make him both a powerful and fun character. As usual, we'll go through his full kit, his best artifacts and stats, his weapons, teams, constellations and Flinvestment priority, and finally my Flins opinion on Flins at the end of the video. This video was filmed on the early access server and is not indicative of the final product. There may be some changes on release, so be sure to check the comments down below to see if there are any. And with all that fluff out of the way, we can flinnily move on to his basic attacks. I'm not even going to try to say that, Demon Spear. Unflins, surprisingly, Flins unenhanced Flins attacks do Flins significant damage. But before moving on to the Flinsane parts of his kit, we need to briefly talk about Lunar-Charged. So what the heck is Lunar-Charged? There are actually two types of Lunar-Charged damage to talk about. There's the Lunar-Charged reaction and Lunar-Charged direct damage. Let's start with the Lunar-Charged reaction. With Flins on the team, every time Electro and Hydro hook up, Electrocharged gets yeeted and replaced by its much more fabulous older sister, Lunar-Charged, italicized with gradient filling, trademark pending. Now, with 200% more branding awareness, it summons an emo-depressed thundercloud over the enemy's head and zaps them every 2 seconds if they're still wet and shocked, just like me seeing Ayaka's dance. Now, let's break it down in the simplest way possible without causing further brain damage. Like Electrocharged, Lunar-Charged scales off of character level, elemental mastery, resistance, and it also ignores defense. But here's the plot twist. Lunar-Charged can crit, so now RNGesus has entered the world of transformative reactions. But hold on to your neurons because it gets dumber, smarter. Instead of just taking the last Electro or Hydro applier, Lunar-Charged throws a group project at your whole party, and damage gets calculated based on everyone who contributed Hydro and Electro, and not equally either. The top damage dealer gets full credit, second place gets 50% of their damage, and third and fourth place gets 1/12. But here's the kicker, despite all this chaos, Lunar-Charged still killed the Regisvine in the exact same time as regular Electrocharged. So yeah, the reaction itself is a side grade, but it's a fabulous looking side grade. It kills with style, and most importantly, it kills with more readability. Now, to add a little bit more clarity to the highly edited segment, here is a much drier and nerdier segment where we simply take a look at the actual damage formula. So the way it works is that basically every character that applied Electro or Hydro will be calculated, and they will each individually go through this formula. And like other transformative reaction formulas, Lunar-Charged has a base damage, roughly 2,600 or something for Lunar-Charged, and it scales off of character level. So you definitely want to level the Hydro and Electro characters up to level 90 in order to maximize the Lunar-Charged damage that's activated by the reaction itself. Then we have various passives that increase the base multiplier, which caps at 14% if these characters reach 2,000 attack, which in most cases, these characters don't have an issue reaching that cap. It also scales quite well off of Elemental Mastery, and in that same multiplier where Elemental Mastery lives, other bonuses to Lunar-Charged damage fall into this multiplier, like for example various weapons, passives, and artifact sets. And unlike other transformative reactions, this can crit, so if it crits, obviously you'll multiply it with your crit damage as well. And the last multiplier involved is that Lunar-Charged is affected by enemy resistances. So as an example, let's say 3 characters applied Hydro and or Electro to the enemy during a Lunar-Charged situation, then the previous formula will be ran for each of those 3 characters. And after the calculations are run, the highest number will have a full 100% scaling, the second highest number will have half scaling, and the third and fourth highest number will have 1/12 scaling. And ironically, even after all this, as you saw earlier, Lunar-Charged ends up being about as strong as Electro-Charged. For Lunar-Charged direct damage, you gotta take the multiplier and multiply it by whatever stat it scales off of, like in Flins' case, attack. Otherwise, it is quite similar to the Lunar-Charged reaction damage, scaling off of Elemental Mastery, Resistance, and Crit, and ignoring the defense multiplier and bonus damage multiplier. However, what's really weird about Lunar-Charged direct damage is that there is a hidden 3x multiplier for no apparent reason. In Flins' case, both of his elemental bursts, his mini bursts as well as mega bursts, most of the damage comes from direct Lunar-Charged damage and therefore follows this formula here with the random 3x multiplier. And now that we understand Lunar-Charged, we can move on and talk about his elemental skill, Ancient Rite Arcane Light, which infuses his basic attacks to deal electro damage for 10 seconds. Okay, this is just adding Flynn Soul to Flingery, as even his Electro Flynn Fused basics are doing Flynn significant damage.
Stop it. Get some help.
At this rate, instead of actually dealing damage, he's only going to be useful for finding and slurping those plump Nodcry balls. So how does Flins actually do damage? Well, after you use his elemental skill, Ancient Rite Arcane Light, Flins can use his other elemental skill during his infusion, elemental skill, Northland Spearstorm. Using Northland Spearstorm now gives him access to his mini burst, which costs 30 energy and deals an instance of Lunar-Charged damage. Since Northland Spearstorm has a 6-second cooldown, Flins can cast this twice during his elemental skill infusion window. Okay, this still isn't very impressive, so let's take it to the next level by having Hydro on the enemy. Yep, with a Lunar-Charged Thunderstorm nearby as well as Ascendant Gleam activated, a second instance of Lunar-Charged damage will smite the enemy, doing a flintastic amount of damage. With just a tiny bit of Ino's health, he was able to one-shot our Regisfine friend. He didn't even need to use his second mini burst to take it out. There are a few more additional details worth talking about in terms of Flins' elemental skill. First of all, you generate an electro particle when you hit an enemy with his basic attacks, electro-infused basic attacks, and I believe it has a cooldown of around 2 seconds. This means that you'll typically generate 4 to 5 electro particles during his elemental skill infusion state. And as for his basic attack damage, the optimization here isn't really worth it, but you should obviously still use them because they do a non-negligible amount of damage. They help, generate the electro particles, and also they will generate some flat energy on hit. This of course applies to pretty much every character, but there's a small chance of generating 1 flat energy when you hit the enemy, and I believe with polearms on average it is roughly once every 7 hits where you'll generate a flat energy point or 2. And one quick little trick is that you can use his elemental skill, then poke the enemy with his normal 1. This will generate the first electro particle, and then you can use his elemental skill 2 and then his mini burst. So this way you have a higher chance of generating up to 5 electro particles during his elemental skill infusion state. Now you've heard me yap a lot about his mini burst, thus implying that he has a mega burst, and yes he does. By spending all of his 80 energy at once, Flins is able to perform his Mega Burst, which does a pretty decent amount of damage, but less damage than 2 of his mini bursts. Generally speaking, Flins' mini bursts tend to be the way to go, but there are some mega rotations where he can utilize his Mega Burst. And if you're confused about me mentioning Ascendant Gleam, well what the heck is that? Let's briefly talk about Moonsign, another new Nodcry mechanic. Basically, many of the Nodcry characters have a passive that provides 1 Moonsign level. With 1 Moonsign character in your party, you get Nascent Gleam. And with 2 Moonsign characters, you get Ascendant Gleam and Nascent Gleam. Various artifacts, weapons, and characters have effects based on whether you have Nascent and or Ascendant Gleam. Finally, non-Moonsign characters also feel like they can contribute because they provide a buff to lunar reactions if you have Ascendant Gleam active. Okay, now we can finally tie all this back to Flins. Since the second Lunar-Charged hit on his mini burst doesn't even activate unless Ascendant Gleam is active, he's frankly barely even a character without that second hit. Thanks to the additional Lunar-Charged strike due to to Ascendant Gleam, and all the other buffs that Ascendant Gleam provides, I know what you're thinking by simply having Ino on the party to provide Ascendant Gleam. Now his mini burst is dealing literally 3 times the damage with Ascendant Gleam in comparison to Nascent Gleam. This issue is also prevalent, although not as crucial, for his Mega Burst as well. His Mega Burst gains 2 additional small lightning strikes with Ascendant Gleam. In this example, his burst did 45% more damage thanks to Ascendant Gleam. In short, Flins gains the following from Ascendant Gleam. He gains 2 extra mini zaps on his Mega Burst, he gains 1 huge zap on his mini burst, he gains the Team Lunar damage buff from Ascendant Gleam from non-Moonsign characters, he gains 15% crit rate and 10% lunar damage from the 4-piece Knights of the Skies Unveiling. He gains 20% Lunar-Charged damage from his passive, and he gains 24% Lunar-Charged damage from the Prospector Shovel if he's using that. Now, all that yapping is admittingly quite complicated, but we can actually make this very flimple. Basically, on every Flins team, there should be another Moonsign character and the ability to apply Hydro onto the enemy. Now, of course, Flins has a bunch of passives as well, so let's rattle through them. His first passive gives him 20% Lunar Charge damage when your team has Ascendant Gleam. His second passive gives him Elemental Mastery scaling based on 8% of his attack stat, capping out at 160 EM or at 2000 of Flins' attack stat. And his third passive enables Lunar Charged, which replaces Electrocharged and improves the base multiplier of Flins' Lunar Charge damage by 14% at 2000 attack. Phew, we're finally finished with all that yapping. Let's smite these flinsolent fools with Flins' full kit. With just a bit of Hydro on the enemy, as mentioned earlier, Flins' standard rotation is able to output 2 mini bursts. And this is already a pretty impressive amount of damage from his standard 2 mini burst rotation, where he only needs 60 energy for this rotation. And as we can see, almost all of Flins' damage comes from his mini Q zaps, with a bit of it also coming from the Lunar Charge reaction, and finally a very small amount of his damage coming from the direct electro damage that he does. Alternatively, Flins can flinflate his damage with his Mega Rotation. This rotation costs 140 energy and incorporates his Mega Burst along with 2 mini bursts. This extra flexibility is Flins-tastic, and in high energy scenarios, Flins is able to keep up with damage flinflation with this mega combo. With certain teammates and or certain weapons and energy recharge stats, he can definitely open up many fights with this and perform this rotation when he does have enough energy. So unlike a character like Verissa who doesn't really utilize her Mega Burst, Flins is more like Skirk in this regard, where he can actually incorporate it some of the times, which is absolutely great. Now you guys may have remembered me yapping about how he can generate 4 to 5 particles during his elemental skill Infusion. Well, this specific rotation I was able to get 5 particles. Gotta be honest, I'm not sure how consistent it is, and I'm sure there are plenty of other alternate combos that will lead to 5 particles, but this one right here, first you use his elemental skill to enter Infusion, then you do a very quick N1 poke to generate that first particle. After that, use EQ in order to, well, do his mini burst. Then I did an N5 dash cancel with an N4 into EQ into N4 dash cancel into N3. And this combo perfectly generated 5 electro particles. Again, a lot more testing is going to be needed to be done in order to see what combos will generate 5 particles consistently, but at the very least, this one worked for me. Also keep in mind that his Constellation 1 combos will change, and this may not work for Constellation 1, obviously, since you have to do that third mini burst. Next, we have a quick comparison with and without everyone's favorite robot, the Ineffa dispenser, Brigitte. By simply replacing Favonius Fischl with Favonius Brigitte, now Flins was able to single cycle our Kongomoto friend. Granted, maybe with the stringless and a better build on Fischl, that might have been barely achievable for Fischl, but regardless, Ineffa is a fantastic buff for Flins. Ineffa increases the base multiplier of Lunar-Charged by 14% and provides a very substantial Elemental Mastery buff to Flins as well. In this example, Flins dealt nearly 20% more damage with his largest Lunar-Charged hit, and with Ineffa's superior personal damage in comparison to Fischl, Flins was able to comfortably one-cycle our green pudgy friend. Who'd have thunk that, lore-wise I guess, a robot and a graveyard man would make a great team, but hey, they're sure to flinish off their enemies and put them 6 feet under. Now for Flins' talent priority, just level up his burst above all else, and as you can see, about 10.1% of his damage comes from his normal attacks, which in this case improves from leveling up his elemental skill, as well as elemental skill type damage, which is his elemental skill 2, so you can level up his skill as a second priority to increase this roughly 13% of his damage output. Then we have the Lunar-Charged reaction, which of course leveling up his talents doesn't affect, so yeah, prioritize his burst, then his skill, and then you can level up his basics last if you feel like it, but you don't even have to level those up. We've made it to the definitive, Flinformative, and Flinspirational math, starting with his artifacts and stats. By far, Flins' best set is the Night of the Skies Unveiling. Since Flins should be used with Ascendant Gleam and pretty much always be used with Ascendant Gleam, the Night of the Skies Unveiling provides, with its 2-piece set bonus, 80 Elemental Mastery, and with its 4-piece set bonus, 30% crit rate, and 10% lunar damage. Clearly this set is designed for main DPS lunar characters, and Flins is a main DPS lunar character. For the Sands, it's attack percent. The other main stats, Elemental Mastery and Energy Recharge, are generally not recommended, but sure, you can use them. Elemental Mastery just gives you less damage than attack percent, so you would prefer attack percent. Energy Recharge though is an interesting option and can sometimes be useful for enabling more Mega Bursts and or battering at the beginning of Stygian Onslaught. However, I think in most situations you're better off with other characters battering Flins, like them using Favonius, over sacrificing a ton of his personal damage with an Energy Recharge timepiece. Next we have his Goblet, where again attack percent is the most recommended. I did calc an Electro Damage Goblet for humorous purposes, and it was about as funny as I expected, or at least I guess as funny as a number on a spreadsheet can be, because I don't have any good punchline to describe how flimsy it feels to use on Flins. Flins' damage distribution consists mostly of Lunar-Charged damage, and while Electro damage doesn't boost Lunar-Charged damage. Next we have the Marichasi Hunter, which is usable specifically with one team, Ineffa plus Fiorina plus a healer. You need Ineffa because, well, you need a second Nodcry character for Ascendant Gleam, and if you're going to replace Ino with Fiorina, then you also need a healer, so therefore Ineffa plus Fiorina plus a healer. You can use this setup in the interim while farming for the Knights of the Skies Unveiling. Next we have the 4-piece Gilded Dreams and 2-piece plus 2-piece combos, which are usable while you're farming for a good 4-piece Knight of the Skies Unveiling. 4-piece Thundering Fury is an interesting option, although I don't recommend it, but I believe it shortens the cooldown on his skill, although I think I might need some additional testing, but it doesn't shorten the cooldown on the second skill that enables his mini burst. As such, his second skill has a 6-second fixed cooldown. Maybe there's some application for this to shorten the cooldown of his regular elemental skill, but overall I don't really recommend it. Next we need to talk about Flin's Flinergy Recharge. Flins needs Flinergy in order to flinish off his Flinemies. With his standard double mini burst combo, he only needs 60 energy per rotation. Alternatively, with his Mega Rotation, it costs 140 energy. Typically, Mega Rotations are much more situational and treated more as a bonus when enemies and/or situations grace you with enough Flinergy. Alternatively, it can be for the first rotation of the cycle when you have full energy. However, here is a chart with various teams and weapons. As we can see, Flinergy Recharge is always a massive moving target, and frankly, in modes like Stygian Onslaught, it complicates it even more as each situation needs different amounts of energy recharge. Anyway, I personally found around 138% Flinergy Recharge to be a very comfortable amount, with non-energy recharge weapons like the Prospector Shovel working well with the Cookie Cutter Ineffa team. Also remember, his signature weapon gives him 12 flat Flinergy, typically around once per rotation, which is why it reduces his Flinergy recharge requirements significantly. Anyway, as always, you'll want to experiment and just squeeze out what Flinergy recharge you can and what works for your account and the fight in question. For substats, it's the usual crit rate, crit damage, and attack percent. Then we have Elemental Mastery, which is okay, and Flat Attack isn't useless either. Lastly, Flinergy Recharge, as we've discussed, is great for Flins, but that is always a moving target. We've finally made it to Flins' weapon options. Unsurprisingly, his signature weapon, the Blood-Soaked Ruins, is best on paper because you can trade off energy recharge to other stats. This thing performs roughly 30% better than his free-to-play option, the Prospector Shovel. This thing provides a lot of stuff for Flins, including additional crit damage, Lunar-Charged damage, and 12 flat energy every rotation or so. The extra energy can help with ramp-up time in Stygian Onslaught, as well as situationally enable more mega rotations. Now keep in mind that this weapon might be overperforming a bit in calcs than in practice, due to having almost no energy recharge substat rolls, because all the rolls were allocated to other stats. I will also say that in practice, this weapon does not feel 30% better, at least when I tried it, than the Prospector Shovel. But that's also because I didn't have the artifacts to shift the energy recharge substat rolls into crit damage, attack percent, and elemental mastery and crit rate. Now the Staff of Scarlet Sands is also a solid option, but sigh no, it does have a catch. The issue is the weapon's very high crit rate secondary stat, putting him at 79.1% crit rate without any crit rate rolls. So this might be more difficult to build depending on your artifact RNG to avoid overcrit, as any crit rate over 100% is wasted. So now Flins can rob Sino of his weapon, his place in the meta, and even his jokes. Then we have some decent 5-star stat sticks, the Fractured Halo, Staff of Homa, Primordial Jadewing Spear, and the Lumiduki Elegy. After that, we've got the Battle Pass weapons, the Deathmatch, and the Ballad of the Fords, which are both good options, especially with refinements. Keep an eye on overcritting though with the Deathmatch due to its high crit rate. And it's time to dig Flins' best Flins to play option out from our empty wallets with the Prospector Shovel. The Prospector Shovel is craftable and therefore very free-to-play friendly, and it provides attack percent as its secondary stat and 48% Lunar-Charged damage. Now it does seem a bit low on this list, but there are a few additional benefits for using this thing. Because Flins only needs to crit 4 times with his regular rotation, it's actually pretty pragmatic to crit fish for those 4 hits. This applies to other weapons as well though, but I figured I'd highlight it just for this one. And due to all the variables mentioned earlier in my Flins showcase video, the difference in the Lunar-Charged damage when it critted from his signature polearm versus the Prospector Shovel was only 8% more, so yeah, that's why I'm bringing this up. Anyway, next we have the Tamayura Te no Ohanashi, and with this specific set of criteria, aka I set a baseline of 138% energy recharge, this weapon actually has the perfect combination of stats. But in teams where energy isn't an issue, then this weapon's definitely not as good. Then we have the Boomer event weapon, the Missive Wind Spear, which is also perfectly usable. Frankly, if you have either the Tamayura Te or Missive Wind Spear, give these weapons a try on your Flins to see if it feels good enough to skip on the resources required for the Prospector Shovel. And anything under these I don't really recommend, except for maybe the Favonius Lance if it can situationally push Flins over the edge for an extra mega burst or something. But he does lose a lot of damage if you build him specifically to mega burst every rotation, and he also extends his rotation and field time where buffs start to fall off, hurting his performance even more, and thus overall personally I don't really recommend the Favonius Lance, but I'm sure some people will be able to be more creative and make it work. Wow, we've reached the whale-ish section of investment priority, Constellations, and level 100. Yep, another new section to add to these guide videos. For Flynn's investment priority, it's a bit of a toss-up between his signature weapon and his Constellation 1. Flynn's Constellation 1 allows him to cast a third mini burst during a standard rotation. It also provides him more energy per rotation, but interestingly, it also leads to him needing about 6 more energy per rotation and thus about 2 to 3 more energy recharge rolls on average. Now, one important thing that most theory crafters often overlook is about how it feels. Having this third mini burst feels really good to use. Between his signature weapon and his Constellation 1, they provide close enough gains on paper, but his Constellation 1 feels way better to use in my opinion because it just feels cool to be able to do a third mini burst. As such, I personally would choose his Constellation 1, and I also prefer the idea of losing a 50-50 to guarantee my next character in comparison to the Weapon Baroness Fate point potentially being wasted. Another question is, what about Ineffa? Frankly, Ineffa is likely the biggest gain to his team's performance because Ineffa provides Flins with roughly a 20% increase to his damage output, a shield, and also Ineffa's own personal damage. If I had to choose between his Constellation 1, Ineffa, and his signature weapon, I would most likely pick Ineffa first because I like robots, then Constellation 1 because I like extra lightning bolts, and then his weapon because I guess I like a lantern on a stick. Granted, there is justification for picking any of these over the others based on your personal preference, so don't let a sweaty basement dweller like myself tell you what to do with your hard-earned Primogems, and we also don't know when Ineffa might get a rerun, so there's also that to consider. Okay, let's finish off his constellations. His Constellation 2 adds some additional Lunar-Charged hits and 25% electro resistance shred. Obviously, this is a great constellation, retaining the tradition that was started in the baguette enthusiasts of Fontaine of having great early constellations. Flins' Constellation 3 provides 3 levels to his burst, which is actually pretty good for a Constellation 3 or 5. Flins' Constellation 4 is boring as it just adds attack and elemental mastery, but it's quite a bit better than the average Constellation 4. Constellation 5 adds 3 levels to his elemental skill, which is just an expensive stepping stone to Constellation 6, and Constellation 6 appears to add a new 35% multiplier to his own Lunar-Charged damage, and a bonus 10% to that multiplier to the entire team's Lunar-Charged damage, which is obviously flintastic. I do find it pretty comical that Hoyo is introducing a brand new multiplier to literally just sell constellations. Not sure how I feel about that, but it is what it is. Flinily, with Refinement 5 on his signature weapon, Flins will do around 4 times the damage of a Constellation 0 Refinement 1 Flins, which is definitely on the higher end of whaling power. Alright, the level 100 section I almost forgot. Flins is a solid candidate for level 95 and 100, being the main DPS for his team and seeing a reasonable 4-ish% increase to his damage output for each 5 levels. It's up to you though whether you feel like you need this bump in power or not, but this is a pretty standard amount of power gain in comparison to other 5-star DPS characters. Okay, up next we've got Flins' teams, and this part's unscripted because I got tired of typing. So anyway, we're going to start off with the Flins plus Ino core, and you pretty much can just mix the second Electro as well as preferably Animo or Resistance Shredder for the last slot. And generally a second Electro is recommended for the particles as well as for Electro Resonance, which helps Flins with his Flinergy. Now Flins, Fischl, Sucrose, and Ino was probably my go-to free-to-play friendly recommended team. This is a good team for the Mega Rotation because of all the energy that Fischl provides. Fischl also deals non-negligible damage, but there is one drawback to this, and that you do not have a healer. Fortunately though, Flins as a character, his normal attacks don't matter too much, so you can just dash and dodge during them, unlike other characters like for example Yoimiya, who really get punished for doing something like that. Flins does not. Also, he has iframes during his burst, so there's that, and Fischl heals herself a bit here and there. So yeah, this team is surprisingly more durable than you would expect because of these factors. Anyway, I also wanted to just briefly mention what builds I recommend on each of these characters, because now with so many different characters, so many different teams, it can be a little overwhelming. So Fischl on this team I recommend for the weapon. Elegy of the End is a fantastic weapon for Flins, providing him attack percent and elemental mastery, both stats that he loves. And if you don't have the Elegy after that, I would say the Favonius is great, well, for energy, obviously, and the Tenacity for the artifact set, and then the Noblesse Oblige as an alternative. Then we have Sucrose, who I would recommend the Thrilling Tales of the Dragon Slayers. And you can consider like another support catalyst like the 1000 Floating Dreams. And after that, if you need some sustain, you can try the prototype Amber. For the artifact set, it's obviously the Viridescent Venerer. I will mention the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers does have buff uptime issues with Flins, and the reason for that is because it has a 20-second cooldown and Flins has a 16-second rotation. And now Ino is obviously here for Ascendant Gleam, but she is also made very well for Flins. Ino has pretty much the shortest elemental burst cooldown for Hydro characters, allowing her to keep up with Flins' short 16-second cooldown rotations. Anyway, for Ino's weapon, overall I recommend the Favonius, and followed by the Aqua Marina Mike Hara, whatever it's called, that provides a small attack buff for Flins if you're not having any energy issues. And then for the artifact sets, the obvious Silken Moon Song. The next team example is replacing Fischl with a sustained character and healer like Kuki. And in this case, you can actually build Kuki for a more healing build. And for Kuki's weapon, overall, I would say the Freedom Sword is the best option, followed by the Favonius Sword. And you can also use the Tenacity of the Millilith on Kuki. Of course, the Electro slot as well as the Animo slot are both very flexible. For example, you can substitute the Electro slot with Yai Miko, more personal damage from Yai Miko, although of course she doesn't provide as many particles, she takes more field time and yada yada yada, so you know, not my most preferred Electro character here, but you can absolutely use her. Then we have Jean, who can use the Freedom Sword, great option if you do have it, providing the attack boost for Flins, or alternatively Favonius Sword, Viridescent Venerer, and Jean of course will heal your team. A couple other Electro and Animo characters I figured are worth mentioning are Auroron, who can use the Elegy for the End, as well as Favonius, and he can use the Noblesse or Cinder City, preferably the Noblesse because Cinder City's bonus damage doesn't help much, but you know, some Electro damage is okay I guess. And finally, if you do have Auroron's Constellation 6, that plus the Elegy for the End actually makes him a very solid buffer for Flins. Up next we have Lanyan, who is a pretty decent Animo sustained character, providing the Thrilling Tales, a shield, and Viridescent Venerer, so if you need a bit more sustain, if you need a shield, then yeah, you can consider Lanyan. Personally though, I prefer Sucrose. Up next, we have the big Lunar-Charged team with Flins, Yeonsan, Sucrose, and Ino. Yeonsan is an interesting character, although she does extend the rotation by a bit. The Symphonist of Sense, if you do have it, as well as the Noblesse Oblige, leads to some pretty impressive Lunar-Charged damage numbers from Flins, and bigger numbers is always fun. And also, Yeonsan's Constellation 2 is great for Flins. Up next, we have Flin's best teams overall, which are the Flineffa series of teams. Flins, Ineffa, Sucrose, and Ino being my go-to recommended team, especially for free-to-play players that might have both Flins and Ineffa. Ineffa, of course, her Fractured Halo weapon is great for the team, boosting all Lunar-Charged damage. And after that, the Favonius is probably the next best option. For her artifact set, overall, I do recommend the Tenacity. Then, if you want to focus on her personal damage instead, you can consider the Gilded Dreams, or two-piece combos. Now, having Ineffa on the team also means you do not need Ino on the team, and that means you can use, for example, Yelan or Kokomi as the Hydro character, but let's talk about Yelan. Yelan, in this case, personally I would recommend Elegy and then Favonius as her weapons, Elegy just being such a good weapon for Flins, and for the artifact set you can consider Noblesse or the Emblem of Severed Fates. Then we have Flins, Ineffa, and Jean and Furina, the team I mentioned earlier in the weapon section, I think, or artifact section. And for Furina, she's actually a great user of the Key of Kajni Sut, which obviously provides a ton of elemental mastery, and she can use the Freedom Sword as well, or the Favonius. Now, Furina might struggle a bit more with energy on this team, so yeah, maybe you just want Favonius instead, but you can also slap on Favonius on Jean as well. But yeah, honestly, I do actually prefer Ino over Furina teams for Flins, shorter rotations, better energy management, etc., but obviously you can consider Furina combos. Up next, we have Flins, Chiori, Shilinin, and Ino. This is, I'm just kind of trying to cook something up, but because, Flins plus Ino fulfills everything Flins needs to perform, you can use characters like Chiori or Shilinin, or heck, even Albedo, because he provides elemental mastery buff and he can use the Freedom Sword. So yeah, you have some interesting options. Double Geo isn't that helpful because it provides bonus damage and Flins doesn't need bonus damage, but Double Geo itself can end up doing some decent damage with like Chiori doing damage, Shilinin, shredding res, etc. Then we have the Flynn Valette team, or Flins plus New Valette plus Ineffa and Kazuha. This is a bit of a meme team, but you can choose who you want to have more field time between Flins and Uvulette as needed, and you can use Kazuha to Hydro Infuse his burst for persistent Hydro application for Flins when he's on field. I'm sure there are plenty of other Flins-tastic teams. I tried a couple Dendro teams, but I didn't like them. But yeah, this should get you started with some basic teams for Flins. There is another really niche team that you can try with Flins, Ineffa plus Furina, and you can actually go healerless and rely on Ineffa's shield for sustain. So what you can actually do is that if you have the Staff of Homa, this is again pretty niche, but under these circumstances, the Staff of Homa, once you reach less than 50% HP, which does take about a rotation or so, you are able to enable the Staff of Homa's less than 50% HP thanks to Furina's HP drain. And at less than 50% HP, the Staff of Homa is actually his second best option. But for the second rotation-ish onward, Flins can have less than 50% HP thanks to Furina's HP drain if you do not run a healer. And on top of that, Furina can just not use her burst because it's not like the bonus damage helps Flins out much anyway, or the rest of the team for that matter. And more testing needs to be done, and I'm spending way too much time on such a niche subject, but you could even skip Furina's elemental skill every other rotation in order to keep up with Flins' short 16-second rotations. Or if you find that the Lunar-Charged Cloud expires, then you can even run Sacrificial on Furina because why not? So yeah, a very niche and way too verbose explanation of why this very specific combination works, and also why I don't really recommend it, but you can use it, it's an option. Okay, I've got a bunch of just Constellations additional showcases for more showcases of Constellation 0 Flins. Definitely check out my, early access CES video. But for this one, we're going to start off with Constellation 1 with the Prospector's Drill. And what's really neat about this is that with the third, mini burst, he was actually able to finish off Kongomoto, which C0R1 Flins wasn't able to do. So I did find that interesting. And next we have Constellation 2, which of course just increases his damage. And now, despite having a third mini burst at Constellation 2R1, he only needed to take it out. Constellation 3 Refinement 1, of course, just increases his burst damage by, providing 3 levels to his elemental burst. And normally, I would aspire to make a standalone video for this, but guys, I am so cooked. So yeah, unfortunately I wasn't able to squeeze this out on top of a bunch of other videos that I had to make for this time period. So yeah, C4 just boosting up his damage even more. I mean, just look at his damage. Flins is definitely one of those characters that benefits a lot from Constellation, but I think he's actually really good at Constellation 0 as well. I feel like maybe some people are kind of underselling him a bit. But, well, I'll talk about that a bit more in the, final YAP session. So anyway, we are at C6R5, and certainly, not, one of the best C6R5 teams yet. But look, he's using Sucrose, he's using Ino, and he's able to still, basically 2-tap 1 Mega Burst, 1 Mini Burst to take out our 5 million HP Gopher friend. And here are the test results that I've compiled with, I always do, tests like this. Usually I format it in a way throughout the video that's a bit more digestible, but in today's case, here it is, just the raw testing that I did. Of course, all anecdotal testing, take it with a giant grain of salt. We have calcs, we have in-game testing. So yeah, feel free to take what you want from each of these, and yeah, hope that helps a bit. Okay, I just wanted to briefly yap about my brutally honest opinion on Flins. Look, does he do more raw damage than Verissa at the moment? I don't think so. I mean, he does some pretty good damage. Reminiscent of what I would describe of Kanish or someone on his release, but I do think for a couple variables that he does have the potential to grow with a potential, couple better support characters, and for example, Sucrose and Ino. Ino in particular stands out to me because perhaps Columbina might come to replace her since she appears to be Hydro. We don't know for sure, but she appears to be Hydro. And regardless of team DPS, here, one thing about, the way that things have been going with Hoyoverse endgames is that they are shilling the endgame mechanics specifically, right? Lunar-Charged has just been super favored, and I have a feeling it will be quite favored for some time moving forward. Of course, not always, but at the very least for a decent chunk while Nodcry is around. And yeah, in my opinion, I actually like the way, in a way, that this is going, because the alternative is just to make Flins just do more damage than Varissa, which he might with his best team with multiple 4-star or 5-star supports down the road. But for now, you know, that's probably not the case. And instead, basically making enemies specifically weak to his mechanic, in my opinion, is a bit of a better direction. It's not ideal because, you know, obviously no one likes to just pull for a character because the mechanic is exactly what is needed to beat the enemy. But in this case, you know, the alternative is just to make him do way more damage than Varissa, which also just feels bad. So kind of having like a side grade / slight downgrade in terms of raw DPS for Flins is a compromise. Let me know what you guys would prefer. Would you guys prefer for Flins just to do more damage, or to, you know, do what he's doing now, which is to have kind of a side grade with a new mechanic that will specifically counter the new enemies? Personally, it's kind of like choosing the lesser of two evils here. I'm just yapping quite a bit, but either way, as you've seen, Flins with his free-to-play friendly teams is very, very capable of handling, you know, all the new Nodcry related Lunar-Charged fights, which, you know, we've already had quite a few. So yeah, that's just kind of my brutally honest opinion on this subject. And another very brief topic I want to touch upon is, does he need Ineffa? Personally, I don't think so. Is Ineffa really good for him? Yes, she is. But in my opinion, Flint feels perfectly usable without Ineffa. Of course, the power difference is noticeable though, so do keep that in mind. And if you're waiting to pull for Ineffa, you do have alternatives with his signature weapon as well as his Constellation 1 to consider. Me personally though, as I mentioned, I like the idea of more lightning blasts, so yeah, I would pick his Constellation 1, and I'm more prone to character banner anyway. Yeah, let me know what else you guys think about Flins down in the comments below, whether you're going to pull for him, how you feel about his place in the meta while Varissa exists, etc, etc. As always, I appreciate every single one of you. This is iFlint to Lose, signing out.